You're listening to the 14th source for all geeky and nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I am Dee Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And we are your two overeducated, codependent nerd hosts, bringing you the things that we like to talk about, but filtered through inquisitive and critical lenses. In the episode for Friday, September 2nd, 2022.
It's September.
That hesitation was me making sure I knew the date because we did not verify before we started recording.
It's okay, it happens. I know, and it's as we're entering September. I mean, a lot of important things happen in September.
Not many things.
Oh, the most important thing though. What happens in September, Dan?
Labor Day.
What else happens in September?
Well, I'll get a Monday off. Actually, I know what you're alluding to, so I've been telling my students not to mesh together my two worlds here. Just to be like super dad joke English teacher, I'm like, hey everybody, it's my birthday on Monday. So I had to talk with the university and they agreed. So they decided to give the entire campus Monday off. So all classes are canceled and the campus is closed. Also, it's Labor Day, but I don't think that factored into it at all.
Did you actually, you did that joke on your students?
Yes, I did. I did do that for my students and they all laughed. I'm sure it was genuine and heartfelt. And then, but my favorite actually, my favorite part of it is the fallout of it because they're like, "Is it really your birthday?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then they're like, "How old are you?" And I always just say like 74. They're like, "Really?" I'm like, "No, I'm 27." They're like, "Really?" I'm like, "No, I'm 62." And then they just never know. I am like Connor McLeod of the Clan McLeod. I am immortal. I am ever young, really, but also old. In spirit and eyes. Really, that's how I define myself, and the bald spot doesn't hurt either. But anyway, we are here to talk about everybody's favorite thing in the world.
Algorithms. Wait. Did we just jump to the end of the episode without telling me?
So if you, dear listeners... No, I mean, we've mentioned algorithms at the end of every single episode. But today, you know what? Let's actually talk about them. I think this is actually technically your wheelhouse, Andrew. Algorithms.
I mean, not the algorithms we're going to talk about. No, but but there are some things that are. I have a lot of wheelhouses, I guess.
You do,
and I
think
you
collect wheelhouses. Actually, it's really strange.
That is strange. It's interesting because I think what we're seeing right now is, we've been seeing the proliferation of AI generated stuff for a while, and some of it sounds like it's always a joke, some of it is whatever, but recently
I think of like the joke ones. I think of the people like that say, I uploaded all scripts written by Quentin Tarantino into an algorithm,
right.
And it produced the first 2 pages of a Quentin Tarantino movie, and it's always silly and funny, but it's strikingly accurate in its own way.
So that's a common thing. But recently, I'd say like this year, and actually in the last couple of months, a lot of people have been talking about art AI. Things like DALL-E 2, I think was one of them. There's another one now. I forget the name of it.
Mid-Journey,
right? Yeah, where basically
that's like the good one, quote unquote, right?
Right, where these things are generating art, or at least images,
right?
Based on some prompting and some feedback and whatever, and it's creating some discussion and a little bit of controversy, I believe, on multiple vectors, multiple issues or things to maybe be concerned about. And so it's about time, once everyone else is done talking about it, Dan and Andrew to the rescue.
That's when we pop in. That's why we're the 14th source.
Yeah.
For all geeky and nerdy news. We let everybody talk first, and then we can just scalp their ideas. And like you said, there's a lot of interesting problems, angles, however you want to sort of parse it, with AR. But I think I want to start by talking about just kind of how it works. As far as we know, we are not experts in this. We have done a little bit of research, but from what I understand, it's the way they tend to work, and this is actually covered in a very brilliant way on the Last Week Tonight, the John Oliver show on HBO. I'll try to remember to post, if I can find it, I'm sure I can, the segment where we talked about this. But basically, it kind of works as you go into these programs, I guess, and it asks you to insert a prompt, and you can kind of type in anything you want, and based on that, it uses its algorithms to generate art based on the prompt you give it. And the thing is, the more specific you get, the more the better your results might be. And like, you can be very specific and say something like, I want to see a reenactment of Washington crossing the Delaware, but in the style of Jim Davis from 1978 when he was making Garfield. And like, you could probably get it. And dear listeners, if you decide to put that into a prompt, please share that result. But because I don't have access to any of this stuff, I just want to make that clear. I'm not invested in this at all. But yeah, but the thing is, this art is created because it's pulling from existing sources from either databases or just the internet. I'm not quite sure.
Well, so usually with a lot of these AI algorithms, at least from what I've read, is a lot of it is they train it, right? Like they put stuff in that for which it basically copies, right? It's not that it's necessarily spontaneously generating things. It is trying to mimic what it's been given, right? That's similar for like the natural language ones, like these scripts, like, oh, I give it a whatever script, but also, with art, right? You feed it a bunch of art, and therefore then it's trying to copy that, but with, in a new way. Right. And I think, one of the examples I did see in an article by Kotaku with Midjourney is that it actually, not only does it, the accusation, or basically the suggestion that it's copying specific artists and their style, to the point where, in fact, even there's one where this AI generated art even has basically the artist's signature.
Yeah, at least it tries.
Or at least it's trying to do the thing it saw, and so that's basically, if you think about it, it's like if you just you had 1,000 images and said, all right, based on all these 1,000 images I gave you, I now want you to create something that looks like this, and it does that. So that's kind of what it's doing, and like I said, that's created some weird issues, because it's like if it's trying to copy a style. Like, on one end, it's like, well, does the style of does the original artist get anything for this, right? Like if we get George Washington crossing the Delaware in the style of Jim Davis, does Jim Davis get credit? Does he get paid? Does he own it? Right?
Well, that's a really interesting part of the conversation. I think we'll come back to sort of the artist side of things later, but I think you bring up an interesting point about ownership, because there's another article I saw from the Smithsonian that, this is from earlier in the year, where a person that owns an AI algorithm or app or whatever tried to copyright
an image
that was created through the algorithm, and they denied it. And it did bring to mind a bunch of things, and obviously you're not super comfortable necessarily going into the nitty-gritty of copyright law, because one, you hate it, two, you're not as in it as you used to be. But like, it reminds me of the discourse and controversy that happened around sampling in the early days of hip hop, right? And they did kind of settle that, for lack of a better word, because whoever you sample from, they're listed as songwriters now. Maybe there's like a time, how long is the sample, that kind of stuff. But generally, the people that you sample from are now creators on your music. And honestly, that's kind of what I'm seeing is happening here. But maybe you can give us some more insight into what exactly is going on here.
Copyright has a lot of different stuff going on here. Right now, the rule with the AI generated copy or images is that, well, there's no actual creative endeavor, or there's no human input, right?
Right.
The idea
the
that
human author, right?
You can't copyright, something that isn't authored by a human is kind of the idea. And there's actually a similar situation with photos taken by a monkey, in the idea that isn't copyrightable because there was no human creative endeavor there. So we're seeing a similar thing on the back end where it's like, well, no, the AI made this. There was no creative process. I guess you could think of it as like, to a certain extent, it's like it's throwing dice, right? You can't copyright the outcome of rolling dice.
You always have to bring it back to tabletop.
I do.
Jesus Christ.
And honestly, that outcome may be contentious, right? It may be that they later decide that there is some creative effort. Because I think what the person who was trying to copyright it was saying, oh, this is just a work for hire, right? In which the employer gets ownership of the copyright. They're basically saying in this case the employee, the artist, was the AI. And of course, Copyright Office is like, no way, Jose. But yeah, like you said with sampling, it's on the other side. If this AI was fueled by a bunch of work by a single author, does that author get anything for it? Right now, the answer seems to be no.
Right.
But that I think that would be really true for like distinctive authors, right? Like you can imagine, like if somehow if someone had an AI that was making art that looked like Salvador Dali, right? Just would he have any ownership over it? If he were around,
or his estate, yeah,
right. Like the idea that like this is, but then again, at the same time, if an artist just paints something in the style of a person, that doesn't mean that there's a, that style is not a thing that invokes copyright, right? Because I make something that looks like a Todd McFarlane drawing doesn't mean Todd McFarlane has some ownership over it.
Or else a lot of indie artists would be getting sued right now. But you actually bring up an interesting point with the guy that tried to copyright his AI-generated art as work for hire. Because some of these, like we talked, the services we talked about earlier, right? Midjourney is the one that has getting a lot of the most recent attention. There are going to be people that probably try to copyright the images that come out of the prompts they put into these algorithms. But in that case, like if the guy that had tried to copyright his image from his algorithm had succeeded, does that mean any image created through these algorithms, even if it's not by the guy that created the algorithm, that he owns everything that comes out of this algorithm? Right? That's kind of horrifying in its own way. So there's that, and then there's also the idea of that's kind of off topic, but the idea of companies hiring, for lack of a better word, AI art.
Or the idea of AI art displacing the work of artists.
Right, because they want to circumvent the idea of paying for the time and the product of an artist. Which, like, there's on some level, I understand that. Do you just need like a background for like a menu for your video game? Fine. Like, but and I'm not saying fine. Like, there are people who love to do UI and stuff like that. But I think the fear is that, like, okay, companies are trying to find a way to replace any art that they need with AI. I don't know. It just seems like a mess. But I'm more fascinated by the fact that for the guy, and again, I'm quoting from this not quoting, but I'm referring to the Smithsonian article about the guy that tried to get his imagery copyrighted. That, like, if that has succeeded, and Andrew, I guess I'm asking you this: would that mean, or would he have viable ownership of any art that's created based on the prompts other users put into that algorithm?
I'm not sure, and I'd have to. I don't know the particulars. My understanding was that I thought he was saying that he is the person that prompted the AI was therefore the owner, not because he was the person that created the AI.
Okay, maybe I read that
right.
Yeah.
But who knows, right? Like, it could go either way, and each one would be would have different outcomes, and right, because you could imagine if the idea that I went to Midjourney and I typed in a prompt and then I did whatever the process is to create, and I found something I liked and I kept it. Am I the employer in this work for hire theoretical relationship, or is this person? Right. I don't know, and that's always an interesting thing to me, because there is I often see things like tools like going back to tabletop RPGs, they're like, people make tools for making like maps and stuff.
Right.
And the idea that say, well, if you use this to make the map, like, who owns it, right? Who owns that map? Well, I put the creative effort into it. It's like, well, but they did too with some of the art assets I use and stuff like that. So there does become that question of like, who is the actual, you know, the owner. Now it's a little bit weirder with, you know, I think with AI art, it's there's the algorithm generator, at least, you know, does something, right? But then so does the person who's prompting it, but then so does the person who provides that original source art. So I think the reason why we don't have a good answer is because there isn't one. This is something that we're gonna culturally we're gonna have to figure out one way or the other, right?
Right.
And I think in whatever they decide, I think there's gonna be implications. I mean, really, what it's gonna I suspect that we're copyright slowly bumping up against things that were not fathomed when copyright law were created, right? And it's just people are gonna have to figure out what we want to do with that kind of stuff going forward.
So I guess on a positive note, could this lead to something you've been thinking about and talking about for a long time, which is like a revision or a re-examination of what copyright law is in the first place?
I mean,
probably not.
Probably not. It's just because like a fundamental overhaul of copyright law that's work. You know, it would involve like we'd have to deal with a lot of stuff, and also there's international implications, right? If one country decides to fundamentally change copyright law for their country, how does that, you know, what happens? The idea, and we do see it currently where like some countries you'll have a copyright on something that's expired in other countries. So like some things are public domain in certain countries, but not others. Right. So that's the kind of thing where like you end up with more of that, or, you know, that kind of confusion as to, well, all of Europe has these rules, but the United States has these rules. So what can and then, you know, other countries have other rules. Right. So I don't see us having any fundamental changes, but we're, you know, I mean, as different countries come to a conclusion about AI art, that could be interesting, right? Like suddenly your AI art is public domain in one country, but owned by the algorithm owner in another. You know, and then owned by the person that prompts it in another, right? That'd be wild.
If AI art even lasts that long, like there is kind of like a flash in the pan quality to this that is kind of making me perhaps not take it as seriously as I maybe should be taking it. But I think you're right, and especially if this AI art is basically pulling from the internet and it's not being discerning. Like, there's no option saying, "Hey, only pull art from artists located in the United States," right? I'm guessing there isn't. Yeah, it's just pulling from everything that's out there. And that's actually there's an interesting response to AI art that I saw. It's from artist Dave McKean. He is probably best known. He works very closely with Neil Gaiman, who we talked about last week. And he's probably most well known for being the cover designer of all the Sandman issues. That was his thing. And his art is very kind of not multimodal, but multimedia, not abstract, but kind of esoteric, very, maybe a little bit of abstraction going on there. It's very weird to the point where, like, especially for people that have been seeing a lot of AI art, kind of looks like AI art. And he did this experiment where he's like, he was basically typed in, I don't think it was Midjourney, but it was like the DALL-E one. What was that called?
DALL-E 2, I believe.
DALL-E, yeah. And he's like, let's just Dave McKean, blah, blah, blah. And he was producing results, and he's like, oh, no. And so he actually wrote a book. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but it's simply called Prompt. And it's about, from what it seems like a really interesting artist's interrogation of this technology. I'll be sure to post a link to the book at the very least. So, and if I am able to get my hands on it, we can talk about it at a later date. But that's an interesting example of an artist directly interacting with something that he feels can legitimately be kind of a threat to his style, not just his, not just scalping his work.
Right. Well, and I was, because, obviously going back to tabletop RPGs, I know a lot of people talk about like, oh, look, you can get things like, oh, I need faces for townsfolk, right? And the idea that something like these AIs could really supplant a whole industry of entry level, like, oh, I did art for this indie RPG. Right. And we're already I've already seen that in some indie RPGs where people are using tools like, well, I went to the AI face generator which just generates pictures of not real of just AI generated faces that look real, and then I process them a little bit, and that's the AI I use in the art I use in my game. Like, so we're already seeing that kind of thing because art's expensive. And so there's that benefit of, wouldn't it be really nice I could generate like a whole bunch of townsfolk for my cool RPG setting without having to pay someone,
Right.
I don't know. And that's the one thing that's like, and maybe this is part of, just the cultural aspect that like, we're finding another way to supplant people's work with robots,
Right.
but we're not actually addressing then the outcome. Like, there's the idea of like, okay, is that okay? But if so, what are people going to do, right? Like, how is someone, if you're an artist that's selling art to TTRPG publishers and suddenly most of what you're doing is being replaced by an AI, what does the country do or the world do to support you?
Right. Up until just now, you weren't being particularly specific. Maybe it kind of sounded like you were either talking about people just writing their own games or whatnot.
No, I mean, for products, right?
For products, yeah. That's where things get weird. Because of that kind of that scalping mentality. Like, in theory, like if you say I want you to produce crowd faces based on the style of super important or super famous and otherwise expensive artist, and it's going to be pulling from that person's artwork, and like I have no sympathy for the super rich, but like they are the ones with the lawyers, right? But the other thing is also vice versa. It's that like it was in the Kotaku article. Actually, I have a good quote here. I think they say it better than I would ever. Who is it that's speaking? John Juarez, an artist who has worked with Square Enix and Microsoft, Squeenix, I apologize, agrees that some companies and clients will only be too happy to make use of AI art, saying, quote, intellectual property will no longer have value for small authors. Because you will not be able to make a Star Wars movie. But Disney will be able to use your work for their Star Wars movie. If AI ends up... that's where the quote ends. And that's an interesting point, like, because it is just kind of pulling indiscriminately from whatever sources that even still our capitalist society allows the big companies to reap the benefits more than the small person, right? And that's where I feel like artists definitely posting their work on the internet need to be protected in some shape or form. And I just don't know what that route would be.
Yeah, and I don't know. And it's weird because I was, looking through, because Midjourney is the one that kind of made some news recently, including this week when a Midjourney art piece won a prize at a fair. Right. For best art or whatever. It's like, well, but there was no art. This is just a guy jerking the algorithm. But at the same time, even DALL-E 2, which is the one of the other ones that has been making the news, like it generates art. Some of it's like, I would not know that was AI generated, right? Some of them are kind of cool. Like, that's a pretty good picture. And then, like, I think of if I were, wanting to do something, like, it would be useful. I could use that, if nothing else, use it as a starting point, and then, make some minor modifications on my own. Right. I don't know.
That actually reminds me. There's an artist I follow on Twitter who has like a secret second account. I won't name him just because even he's been kind of not sketchy, but wary about talking about this second account where he has been showing augmented AI art. But basically he's doing exactly that. He's like, he does like a lot of sci-fi comics and concept art and stuff like that. Yeah, he's using that as a foundation. He's like, come up with this crazy prompt and see what comes out, and then he arts on top of it, which is a disgusting sounding phrase.
It really is. Oops, I arted all over this.
He just backs up and arts all over it. Even though he's still using and in a sense probably cannibalizing artists that are out there, at least he's making it his own instead of just right click saving the JPEG and then posting it somewhere and saying mine. Right? At least there is further artistic intent and act done upon that art that, to me, at least has it earned that name of art more than just saving your favorite image from a result query, right? And that can have some place, because some of these, as you said, especially with Midjourney, there's some wild art out there that I'm sure there are artists out there that could come up with the same or similar imagery, but almost as like a inspiration piece. Like, it could be a really cool place to start. And in that sense, I see a lot of application for artists more in a concept and design kind of direction rather than final product application.
Yeah, and I mean, and like I said, some of the other options, because it's also not just generating original art, put that in quotes, but also like, for example, DALL-E 2 has all sorts of options of like, hey, taking a source image and then creating variations inspired by the original, like direct, like you put in, here's a whatever picture, and it creates things that look kind of like that picture. So there's a lot. There's just a lot to it. I don't know. It is kind of like, and I say this as I was looking, because honestly, I was looking through the DALL-E 2 website earlier, and it is like, oh my gosh, the examples they provide, it's like, holy crap, this is actually crazy, But anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I'm kind of overcome it, like it just how much can be done with it.
So it makes you think of like, what could the solution be in the short term, right? If we can't have something legally binding like we have with artists sampling other artists, where it's like, okay, that person is actually now credited as a songwriter. Again, I haven't interacted with any of the AI art generators, but I wonder, do they tell you their sources? Do they tell you, this is also, I guess, me as an English teacher, do they cite their sources? Do they tell you where they're getting this art from, so that at least you can give credit to the artists that even unknowingly contributed to the image that was generated?
Well, I don't know, and I think it probably depends on the two. Because like looking at DALL-E 2, they show examples of saying like, do this thing in the style of Andy Warhol, right? And it looks like an Andy Warhol thing, and so obviously in that case maybe you'd credit Andy Warhol. I don't know, but I don't like, because if you think about it, when they train these AIs, they feed it a huge amount of data. So it's like they probably went through, DeviantArt and just pulled every image, whatever. They went to wherever source they could find and pulled every image they could. So like, I don't even know can you even credit, and do you know what influenced what, right? There's not, I don't think there's a way to say like, well, this picture was directly influenced by these 6 images. Like, I don't think it does that. I don't even think it knows that, because I think at this point the AI, the neural net, whatnot, I don't think it's like tracking that. It just has a framework that it builds on. At least, that's my guess. I don't know this stuff, because AI stuff is all witchcraft.
Right, like baking.
Exactly.
I think the thing that makes AI art scary is the fact that I'm just going to be bold and say morally corrupt people will be using it.
Yes.
That's the scary part, because I think, like I said earlier, in terms of practical use by people that are using it as inspiration, as jumping boards for their own creativity, like it actually has an incredible practical purpose. And maybe even putting it behind paywalls like that, it's like, hey, here's a design tool for studios to use, right? That could be, I guess, a short-term solution, but it's already out there, so it's impossible to gate at that point.
Well, they're all gated right now. That's the one big thing, is that all of them have wait lists.
Oh, interesting. Well, otherwise, it's like a free. Do you know if it's like? Do you have to pay for it, or is it free?
I don't
admission?
know.
They just gotta let you in.
That's my understanding. And so my guess is it probably doesn't take. It's probably that's just their way of gating access. Right. I don't know. And of course, then eventually they could put it all behind a paywall if they wanted to, right? Who knows?
I think the scary part for me is like, also aside from morally corrupt people using it, well, I guess building off of that, is that if this becomes common practice by corporations, right, to sidestep paying artists, like, is that how they view art? Like, are they just cool with it being, like a gelatinous, barely stitched together image of coherence, like it's something that it's almost like an uncanny valley thing. It looks pretty, but it also looks a little off, and they're like, that's good enough. And is it good enough for companies in the future to just stop using people who's made this their life's work, who's dedicated their time and attention to actually designing and drawing and painting and all that stuff. That's what kind of scares me. It's like, well, is that creating kind of a homogenous future for art? It's all going to be this weird blobby mess, albeit beautiful and interesting. This is echoed again. I was really happy to see this quote from the artist. This is in the Kotaku article. The artist Simon Stalenhag. I might be saying his name wrong. I apologize. But if you haven't seen his work is awesome. It's like this weird, kind of like brutalist sci-fi stuff. It's like rural, desolate settings where there's also like just like a rusted huge ass robot or something like that in the background. It's really cool. I think there's even like an Amazon show that was based on one of his books. But he said this, and I'm quoting from the Kotaku article: "What I don't like about AI tech," and it's going to make a music joke here, but is not that it can produce brand new 70s rock hits like Keep On Glowing You Mad Jewel by Pink Floyd, but how it reveals that the kind of derivative generated goo is what our new tech lords are hoping to feed us in their vision of the future. I think AI art, and this is still Stalenhag speaking, just like NFTs, which we haven't talked too much about, is a technology that just amplifies all the shit I hate with being an artist in this feudal capitalist dystopia, where every promising new tool always ends up in the hands of the least imaginative and most exploitative and unscrupulous people. End quote. I'm like, that's, yeah. But is that where it's going? Yeah. Probably. Yeah. Yeah. You know what? The only thing I want to put into AI art is into an AI art algorithm is to say, generate me a brand new pastoral Windows 95 background. Let's see what happens.
Oh, and I bet you it'll make some amazing looking stuff.
Yeah.
You know, at least if you take enough time, because I think the idea is it generates lots of stuff. And you're like, oh, okay, well these are bad, but this one looks pretty good. You know, so
yeah.
And like I said, I mean, I always think about like, is someone, you know, who I have my long standing fantasy that someday I'll publish some RPG content, and I always think like, oh man, wouldn't it be cool? I could generate, you know, stuff using that, you know, like the idea that I'd have some tool to generate art, you know, that I wouldn't have to pay for, right? That's cool, because you know, in something like an RPG, art is often very essential, right? You know, when you look at like the joke is half of what you pay for your D&D book is just pictures of art. In fact, I think when they made the Magic the Gathering art books, that's when they started doing the crossover to D&D, because one guy looked through the art book and like, this is just a D&D book. Let me write a 20-page supplement for it.
Did we just expose that the artist Boss Logic is just an AI algorithm? After his D&D movie,
that's, you know, I mean, right? Like Boss Logic isn't a person; it's just a prototype art AI.
He just happened to also be a person, but you know, you got to practice the fundamentals.
So it's
AI art. We don't have a solution for it, but it is interesting, and I fear a dark future going ahead, but I think there are also silver linings.
Right, and
but we'll just have to.
It's see. Funny because, you know, I was thinking, my last thought on this is thinking, looking back to Star Trek: The Next Generation, and when they go to the holodeck, and how the holodeck clearly has an AI art algorithm, right, where they can just say, I want something like this, but like this. And I'm like, okay, boop, 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 and it mixes it up, you know.
Shit, it does win. It wins. AI art wins. You know what? A lot of those Star Trek ships look like they were generated through an AI algorithm.
Ouch.
So fair. It is the future. So if you, dear listeners, have any thoughts about the topics we discussed this week, feel free to leave your thoughts as comments on the page for this episode at forallintents.net.
You can also post your comments or engage in conversations with other listeners on our Facebook page.
You can find us on other social media as well, such as Twitter or Instagram, where you can find us at our respective handles. On Twitter, you can find Andrew at Profound Dark, tweeting about tabletop role-playing games, and you can find me at dbethel. You can also find us on Instagram, where you can find Andrew at Profound Brick, and me and my work at dbethel Comics.
Well, you're at our website at forallintents.net. You can also take a look at our YouTube page, which you can find by clicking on the link that says YouTube. Or you may already be there listening to our show, which is now featured on YouTube. If you are, feel free to like and subscribe, or as the kids say, ring that bell.
We use two tracks of music for our show. One is called Disco Medusae, the other is called District 4. They're both written and performed by Kevin McLeod of the Clan McLeod, immortal swordsman, graph paper enthusiast, and musician extraordinaire. And hopefully not an AI algorithm. But he puts out so much,
right? He does.
Like he might be, dude. I don't know.
You can find his music at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and that's all licensed under the Creative Commons 4.0 attribution license.
If you like the show and like to help us out, the best way to do so would be to subscribe to the show using whichever podcasting service you happen to use. What would help us out even more, though, would be to go to their storefront and leaving some sort of review, whether a text review or using their proprietary metric will help spread the word to new potential listeners through the magic of algorithms. It all comes back around.
Algorithms.
So, do you know how I'm going to spend my birthday, Andrew?
What?
Inside, in the air conditioning, because I believe it is projected to be, on one of these weekend days, 107 degrees.
Yeah, no, it is not. Seattle's not really. I mean, it's not that hot, but it's not. It's very humid and hot. You know, I think we had 90 degrees earlier this week. Mm-hmm. And it just so everything just gets kind of muggy, you know?
Yeah.
Not that I'm going to make the dry heat comment, but.
But do you know what else is hot?
What?
Man, and I'm excited to talk about it probably when the season ends, but I've watched both episodes as of this recording of Shulk. And, dude, I think. You said last time we talked that it's got vibes of what you and I have been looking for in a She-Hulk show, and yes it does. I am enjoying it. Holy cow! It is a breath of fresh air, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
Oh, it'll be exciting.
So until you see what's next, dear listeners, I'm D. Bethel,
and I'm Andrew Asplund,
and for all intents and purposes,
that was a podcast. So probably the weirdest thing about playing Final Fantasy 1 with weird class choices is I have 2 black belts or monks.
Right. You had a fighter and you had...
Fighter, thief, monk.
Fighter, thief, monk. Okay.
So no casters.
So when upgraded, they become the fighter, ninja, black belt, black
belt. Knight, ninja, master.
Sure. I don't like the sort of slave narrative being told there, but sure.
Oof, it's like you've been reading my D&D.
You ready to talk about some eye art?
Sure.
Cool.
We start with the discussion of high art. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey.
Let's just go. It's fucking 101 degrees outside. I'm not wearing pants.
Ah.
That's called a party.